7 Reasons Vietnam Doesn't Resent the U.S. for the War. The Vietnam War dragged on for 2 decades. The Soviet Union backed North Vietnam. The United States supported the South. The Americans used chemical weapons. They caused casualties among both the enemy soldiers and civilians. The U.S. military suffered 58,200 casualties. 3 of the 6 largest Vietnamese cities were destroyed. You'd think there'd be some serious grudges, but 76% of Vietnamese people view America favorably. Here's why. 1. Vietnamese mentality. In 1998, the U.S. ambassador to Hanoi married a Vietnamese woman. He was a former pilot. He had flown 60 bombing raids over North Vietnam. He was shot down in 1966. He spent 7 years as a prisoner of war. Despite his wartime role, the marriage sparked no backlash. Unlike China, Vietnam has no territorial quarrel with America now. 2/3 of the population were born after the war. The younger Vietnamese have no memory of it. The Vietnamese generally look ahead, not behind. 2. Anti-war sentiment in the U.S. The Vietnamese think many Americans oppose the war. They look at this conflict as an elite imposition. If anything, they may overestimate the American public of that era. In 1965, 24% of Americans thought Vietnam was a mistake. A whopping 60% supported the war. By 1968, sentiments had shifted. 54% said it was a mistake, and 37% were still in support. 3. China and Russia. Vietnam resented Russian and Chinese imperialism more than the U.S. The Soviets were seen as rough and greedy. Lean Soviet Rus had a negative connotation. China's centuries of dominance outweighed the decade-long war with America. Vietnam still regards China as a greater threat. 4. Economic cooperation. In 1994, the U.S. lifted its trade embargo on Vietnam. In 1995, the nations normalized relations. In 2000, Bill Clinton was the first U.S. president to visit the country since the war. His visit was welcomed by the Vietnamese populace. Later, both countries signed a bilateral trade deal. Driven by pragmatic motivations, Vietnam has moved past the war. Now it's reaping the benefits of working with America. In 2022, their bilateral trade was $138 billion. 5. Vietnam's victory. North Vietnam paid a heavy price, but won the war. Their strategy was simple: resist the Americans until they gave up, and unify the country. They didn't have to beat the U.S., just outlast them. 6. American culture. The Vietnamese actively consume American culture. They enjoy the same movies, music, and fast food. Culturally, they feel closer to the U.S. than to China, for example. 7. Common enemy. 76% of Vietnamese people hold a favorable view of America. Only 16% feel the same way about China. In 1979, Vietnam and China fought a border war. It's just as remembered in Vietnam as the American War. Today, both Vietnam and China are in dispute over the Spratly Islands. There's a real possibility of conflict. Both Washington and Hanoi are wary of China's global dominance. They are willing to reach out to old enemies for support.